Well, welcome to the New Testament survey about the canon of the New Testament. What is a canon? Is it a copier? Is it a camera? Does it blow things up? Well, a canon is really a measure, and that's what these things do, or taking measures of things in a way, I guess. But at any rate, we're looking at the New Testament canon. So here is the definition. It's a straight rod or a bar ruler testing the straightness by carpenters or masons back in the time. It's a metaphor sometimes used. What is the norm? What is the rule of thumb or something like that? We're looking in the New Testament for the 27 books. What has been measured or accepted? So in the New Testament we have 27 books, starting with the book of Matthew and ending the book of Revelation. So the canon, how did we get it? How did we get these 27 books in this one piece? It didn't happen overnight. They were written over a period of several years and by several different people. So we're going to take a look at the New Testament canon. It took a fairly big span of time, but by comparison with other religions and other things that we have copies of, the New Testament was a fairly short term in the making. Now there's a difference between the canon of the New Testament and the writing of each book. Because each book was written separately, they were all written by AD 95. But from there, and that's spanning from about 33 is when Jesus died on the cross. So that's 60 years hang time between events and then actual writing. Compared to the Quran, which he wrote around 650. Actually, Muhammad didn't write at all. He couldn't write, couldn't read either. He just had visions in a cave and then came out and told people, and they wrote. But the events he talked about were some of them over 2,000 years old. And so there was a long hang time, at least 2,600 years. And then compared to other works of other religions, 400 years before works of Buddha were actually written down that we know of and have any access to. And even at that, it's another 500 years of some of the oldest stuff we have of Buddha. Shinto, kind of the same way, 700 years, and it was actually in 722 AD before Shinto stuff was actually written down at all. In Hinduism, a similar thing. There's a hang time of some 500 years. We don't even know some of the events. Some of them may be made up. We don't know much about them. But Homer, same kind of thing, and the same thing with the information we have about the Caesars. And the Caesars, we don't have very much information about. We're talking, maybe 500 manuscripts at best. Some would say maybe only 100. Yet we have thousands for the New Testament. All the New Testament books were composed by 95, and some of the earliest ones were probably Mark or James, written between 49 to 55. And they were written about by a guy by the name of Muratorian. He wrote a canon. According to Metzger, about 170 AD, and then the Marcion canon was written about 144. He basically said the book of Luke and a few books of Paul was what he accepted, and that was in the 2nd century. But other people wrote about a lot of other things, of these items of canonicity, if you will. So what's the difference between accepted and not accepted books? What made people accept them? The acceptance came over a period of time when people were looking at who they were written by, or were they closely related to these people. For instance, Mark, was a close companion of Peter, as we understand, and wrote about the events of Jesus' life, an important part of his ministry. And then, but he got his information from Peter. Even though he himself was not an apostle, tradition is that he did hang around the apostles some, even while Jesus was alive. So maybe knew some of the information firsthand. But also the contents of these books, the questions would be like, are they spiritual in nature? Do they seem to go with what maybe really happened? Were these books accepted by the early people, by the early churches, by the people that wanted to read them? And how were they accepted? Did they make comment about these things? And were they inspired, divinely inspired by God? Now, Bart Ehrman doesn't mention any of these things, but these are some of the things other writers recognize that were important to the New Testament canon and the making of it. Some confusion came because there were other people writing about other books. And there was a guy that acted like he was Peter but wasn't. He wrote the Gospel of Peter. The same thing with the Gospel of Judas. He wrote a Gospel of Judas, but he himself wasn't Judas. Gospel of Barnabas. So these people wrote, and then a question, well, are the Gospels really true? Or are other books? So people started comparing and questioning, but there's a lot of confusion, and when you cannot have quick communication with a phone call, you have to wait 4 months before your letter actually gets there because it's by mail, which has to travel by boat, which may or may not actually get there because people may or may not be dependable. And then the reply might take another few months. So you can see how problems can occur in communication, and the challenges of communication were great. Origen didn't accept Hebrews and 2nd Peter, 2nd, 3rd John, questioned some other ones, and as a lot of people did. But he accepted the Gospels as we know them, and so on. And this was about 230 AD. Then there were others, as I mentioned, the Gospel of Peter and Judas and Barnabas. They're called pseudepigraphia. And people may have not accepted these. Some might have liked them, and they read them. It didn't do a lot of harm. It's just that they weren't what we have today. And then the Apostolic Fathers wrote about the New Testament, commented, and then wrote a lot of information. And they were people who wrote a lot about the New Testament for the first 400 or 500 years. And there were other books and groups. So the New Testament was written about and mentioned that there were a list of books that were trustworthy. They called it a canon as early as 150 AD. Now, I want to comment, the CE and AD are basically the same thing. The CE comes from, in your textbook, you can read about why they do that, but it's called the Common Era. And then the other one, the AD, does not stand for after death. Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. It's Latin. That's where the AD comes from. And these guys, the new scholars of the day, on page 12, it's in our textbook, there's a little blue box so you can read about this. So sometimes they use AD, sometimes CE. It doesn't really matter to me. But Irenaeus and then Origen, all these people, these are apostolic fathers. And then another book that I use for world religion class, Michael Malloy said on page 362 that by 230 CE, all 27 of the New Testament books were compiled, codified, and copied. They'd been copied since the day one, but they hadn't been arranged in a book form like we have it today until some 200-300 years later, at least 200 years. The New Testament canon is also talked about by Athanasius. He wrote that All of these books were authoritative and accepted by all Christians, and he wrote in about 367. If he wrote it at this time, it was most likely accepted as much or many as such many years before. It makes sense. Also, the Latin Vulgate was commissioned by Pope Damasus, the first in 382 to Jerome, and he went to Bethlehem and compiled the New Testament documents and translated them all into Latin and completed in 405. And he also did the old parts of the Old Testament and other books. But he had the New Testament books as we have it done by 405. Persecution played a little bit of part in the New Testament canon in that it spread all over the world, this gospel message. You need to remember, the gospel is good news, and it's not just talking about 4 books. Claudius was an emperor that didn't want the Jews to live in Rome, so in Acts 18 you can read about that. And then we know of Nero. He's probably during the time of persecution of Christians, even in Bible times or shortly after. He was the emperor during the times of some of the books written by Paul and Peter. He wasn't a good man. He claimed that Christians were bad for society. Vespasian, Titus, Diocletian, they all did different things, different forms of persecution. It was kind of in vogue to persecute Christians. It hadn't changed a lot, I don't think. But Constantine was one that became a Christian, and he said, no, it's allowable to be Christian. Now, not everyone followed that, not even everyone in his under his roof. But it did did give some of the Christians relief. But because of persecution, the information did spread around the world. So this information came on texts, and the texts are these scrolls that we have here, and then this is a codex form, a book version that came a little bit later. And they're written on 2 kinds of material, a paper-like material called papyrus, formed out of a plant found only in Egypt along the Nile, or vellum, possibly parchment. Vellum and parchment are similar in that they are animal skins. Vellum comes from cows. Parchment comes from sheep or goats. That's the distinctive. Vellum might be from deer or from antelope even, but parchment came from sheep or goats. The style of text on the paper or leather that they used are called, the textiles are uncials or minuscules. And depending on the style of writing, if they're all capitalized, they're uncials. And minuscules are minuscules, kind of, I like to say, because they have miniature letters. We have capitalized and small letters. We're used to that. Language has a tendency to change, and so does the form of language. Well, they weren't using small letters. Time of the New Testament was spreading, people started using small letters, and they don't look like big ones. So a lot of things to figure out when you're looking at texts. And what we're getting into now is a whole different field of study called textual criticism. With textual criticism, they're trying to figure out what the original text actually said. And this happens for people who are studying Shakespeare, or if they're studying Aristotle, or if they're studying Josephus. They're trying to figure out what did the original guy write. And that's what we're trying to do with the New Testament. And they're all written, or not all, but many and the first writings seem to have been all in Greek. And then they expanded on those, they had little lectionaries that they added to them. They were also in other versions, so they were translated. They were translations. It would be a better slide, I guess. rather than versions, but they translated from Greek into Latin or Egyptian, Coptic, Arabic, Syriac, Hebrew, and so on. And the apostolic fathers, or the patristic writers, as I mentioned, they wrote a lot about the texts. So we get information from them as well. And the texts come and we find them years later, and then we start codifying them. We put numbers to them and identify these texts so we know what we're talking about. So we have the papyrus texts start with the letter P, and then they're numbered. And there's several hundred of these. Some of them are in codex form. Some of them were in scroll form. But they name them P, with the number. The Chester Beatty papyrus, 1, 2, and 3 are these, are numbered P45, P46, P47, and so on, so that people know what they're talking about. And then there are some great uncial codexes that had a lot of the New Testament, and they were already kind of put in a book form. And they're different ones: Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, and then Ephraemi Rescriptus, and then Codex Alexandrinus. These all have different information, or they have our New Testament books in Greek, but in uncial rather. And this is kind of what they look like. You can read more about it here, the Roman uncial. But here, this is done on papyrus. It's a paper that will rot, so it's kind of faded out here if it's found in dirt or in an old jar or something. And they pull it out, and this is what they can find. This obviously is a picture of one. And then might do this. This is a little bit newer. I would expect this is probably only a couple, well, maybe 1,500 years old at worst, maybe 1,000 even, and same with this one. But the uncials and minuscules are the writing, not on what they're written. It's actual, the writing is stuff. So here the deal in textual criticism, it's important to remember, and this is what they're using to study the texts, are the Greek manuscripts. There are 5,800 of them. Latin manuscripts, or 10,000 of those, and various other languages. So you have to get into language, really like it. But they've used these over the course of time to help us understand what we have in the New Testament. And it's pretty close. I think it's within 1% of what the original writers wrote. Codex Vaticanus was probably written about 325 AD. It lacked some of Hebrews, some of the letters of Paul in Revelation, along with other verses missing. It was discovered by a guy by the name of Tischendorf in a particular monastery in 1844. Just kind of the history of it. So with all these texts, over 5,000 of them, no two are identical. That's the downside. The upside is, now, how do we know they're not totally falsified? If they're not all the same, how do we piece these together? What are we looking for? Well, we're looking for external and internal evidences. The external evidences are the patristic fathers, and the internal evidences are the manuscripts themselves. And with these, we can piece together an understanding of how these things were distributed and if what they contain are real and true or not. What Bar Ehrman says on page 23 of our textbook is the vast majority of these hundreds of thousands of differences are completely and utterly unimportant and insignificant. And they don't matter at all. By far, the most common differences simply show us that the scribes in the ancient world could spell no better than most people can today. How many ways can you spell the word the? Or maybe you left out the word the. Or maybe you didn't know how to spell thousands, or majority, or common. or differences, and so on. So every one of these differences are differences in manuscripts, and some people would think that they're, because of that, they're corrupted somehow. But that's not the case. There are some accidental mistakes and there are some intentional errors possibly. We can only speculate on which one's what, but we are looking at the manuscripts to see which one maybe is the oldest. It might explain which one originated the others, which manuscript did they copy from, and using a little detective work, we're trying to figure out where they were distributed, and that's only important because maybe people in Egypt spelled things a little bit different than they did in Palestine, which they would spell a little bit different if they were in Italy, even all using Greek. However, we know people in Italy speak Italian, people in Palestine may speak something else, and people in Egypt at the time spoke Coptic. So the people in Palestine might speak Syrian or Syriac. They might have speak Arabic or Aramaic. Who knows? But at any rate, the considerations of these things are all very important. They also need to consider the style of writing. That is the vocabulary, and does it sound like maybe Paul wrote this or not? And then we're looking also at some difficult readings and maybe even the shorter ones. And finally, we're looking at the quality of the manuscript. Is it a reliable one? It looked like there's a lot of erases over it. We found manuscripts written over manuscripts. So there's a lot of challenges. But it comes down to, we have some great translations. And we have an important document that we're going to study and go through. I'd like to just make a quick mention of the New Testament translations. Every translation outside of Greek is a translation. So let's make a difference here between the King James and the NIV. The King James was a translation that finished its translation in 1611. They didn't have the best manuscripts at their disposal at the time. They did the best they could. They used a manuscript that some people would say is a little flawed. Textus Receptus. It's a manuscript a guy put together, getting the manuscripts he had and trying to make a good text for the New Testament. And then there's the challenge of, why are they making a translation? You might look in at the introductions. Why is this translation being made? The NIV made it so that people that knew English could read it in a very common English setting. Not English as far as England, or in it weeded out English that you might feel in Australia. And they didn't want to make it sound American. And they didn't want to make it sound Canadian English. What they wanted, they didn't want it to sound even South African English. They wanted it to sound like anyone that could speak English would understand what's going on. So that's why there's some of the various differences. And then there's American Standard Version. Well, that was an American. And the New American, and so on. And so they find text, people change, language change, cultures change. So they want to relay the original as best they can into what people use today. Of course, there's no other King James version in any other language. It's only in English. There's no King James in Spanish. And there's no King James in Portugal or Portuguese. There's no King James in Chinese. It came into English because the king authorized it and challenged people to translate it, kind of to snub at the Pope. But anyway, so translations are done for different reasons. That's why there are so many. For the most part, they're all pretty good. So do a summary of this video, and we'll see you next time.